Great, 10 o'clock, so we can start.
Yes, 7:30, we can start.
Wonderful. So let's start with this new perspectives development in a social consciousness, so to say. We call it social development of consciousness. And today we invited Devdip Ganguli, who is the ashramite who was educated in the ashram school and is now teaching Sri Aurobindo's social and political thought in ashram and other institutions in India, such as Gnostic Center. He has a wonderful course there on human cycle and the ideal of human unity. So today I would like to invite him to talk to us on these two major social works of Sri Aurobindo, which are very significant and important for our understanding of the development and the future of humanity. We will have 40 minutes of presentation and 20 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So please, Devdip, please take your...
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. So in case in the course of the presentation, if there is a thought or a question which occurs to any of the attendees, I mean, they're welcome to, to put the question out, and I'll either address it straight away or take it up at the end. Vladimir, can the attendees post the questions? How
yes,
can they?
Yes, please. You can put your questions into question and answer section, or better to that section rather than into the chat. Yeah. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. So I'll pick up the questions from there. All right. So good evening, good morning. Now, we commonly associate spirituality with individual self-perfection and transcendence. And one of the most important characteristics of Sri Aurobindo's approach to yoga, what we term as the integral yoga, is that it embraces all the various aspects of existence. And so life is made a part of the province, the field of practice. And so this collective, the collective aspect of human existence is often ignored in spiritual traditions because the entire focus is on individual transcendence. Though there have been attempts, of course, in the past to try and arrive at some kind of, say, spiritual communal living, there have been attempts to transform or work upon certain sections of society. But it's important to understand that a spiritual transformation of the collective as a whole is an idea which is a radical contribution of Sri Aurobindo. And so the individual on one hand and the collective on the other hand, both form an important parallel, two sides of the coin, so to say. If we look at Sri Aurobindo's life himself, if we look at Sri Aurobindo's life, we see clearly that he begins his career, so to say, by launching himself. So there's an initial period of after he returns to India, he's studying, he's at Baroda, he's teaching, he's part of the king's administration, Maharaja's administration. And then he joins the political movement and becomes one of the most important personalities in the first decade of the 20th century. And he writes some very powerful pieces which play a crucial role in waking up something in the general consciousness of the people. And so his first major activity publicly is in the political sphere. Subsequently, when he comes to Pondicherry and so to say retires from active life, he's still very engaged with what is happening in the world outside. He is still following closely. He interacts with a few prominent personalities. He writes about social and political philosophy and ideas. And later, when the Second World War and the movement of the independence of India moves towards fruition, we see both from his from his writings, but also through his conversations with disciples, that he's keeping track of what is happening, he's following up, and he's even participating in an occult yogic way in the movements of the world. So Sri Aurobindo's notion of spirituality is not merely an individual perfection, but something that encompasses the totality of the human race. And so two works of Sri Aurobindo, two books, are, we can say, the principal works of social and political philosophy. They are called The Human Cycle and The Ideal of Human Unity. And these books were written about a century ago, between 1915 and 1918. Interestingly, when the First World War was taking place. And so at a time of great churning of the world, when Sri Aurobindo writes these texts based in Pondicherry here. And what's interesting about both of these works is that they seek to give us a certain understanding of the world which is based on a deeper vision of things. The common mistake that people make is to confuse politics and political philosophy or social philosophy. We are, of course, not interested in the politics of the present or the politics of the past. What we want to understand is a key to decipher the play of forces that lead the collective existence in the direction that it is going. So, one important hallmark of both these texts is that they insist on a cosmic, detached, wide view of existence. Though there are examples which are contemporary, there are examples from history, but really Sri Aurobindo's perspective is universal. So we stand back from the present moment, we stand back from the superficial play of news and events, and we try to trace the broad spectrum of the progression of human life, the course of human life over centuries, over millennia. And the attempt is to try and understand, where is it coming from, what is happening now, and where is it going. And so Sri Aurobindo's vision of social and political philosophy is rooted in his approach to the idea of evolution. And what we mean by this idea of evolution is, of course, there is biological evolution, which we understand, the evolution of species, the Darwinian notion of evolution. In spiritual traditions, we understand the evolution of the individual, the progressive growth of the individual through lives, through experiences. But there is similarly a collective evolution at play. And this is an interesting idea, which again, something which is quite new and which Sri Aurobindo emphasizes on, that even collectively, we are progressing towards a certain goal realization, which is imminent. There are three lines from Savitri, Vladimir, which kind of summarize this sort of total movement forward, where Sri Aurobindo says, all life is fixed in an ascending scale, and adamantine is the evolving law. In the beginning is prepared the close. So this notion of everything is moving in a certain, not predetermined way, but towards a certain predetermined goal of the full manifestation of the spirit, is something that is there at the background of these texts. It is fixed as something that is a reality. And what we are now looking at is to try and make sense of that progression, of that movement, of trying to understand how this movement has proceeded and is in process. So in the human cycle, and we'll take up the human cycle first, you mentioned right at the beginning Lamprecht while we were chatting, well, waiting for others to join in. So in the human cycle, Sri Aurobindo starts with an interesting idea. He uses 5 words to describe 5 phases of the evolution of society. So he says There's a German social philosopher who actually uses these terms, but Sri Aurobindo uses the terms and gives them a completely different meaning, much beyond what Lamprecht, the original author who used the terms, had intended for them. But Sri Aurobindo says he caught upon these words express a certain truth, and then he elaborates on these terms. So what are these 5 sort of stages through which humanity has passed and is moving, even still now? So he begins with the symbolic age. And the symbolic, let me list the 5 stages, and then we can talk a little bit briefly about the 5 stages. So the first is the symbolic age, then the typal age, then the conventional age, then the individualistic or rational age, and finally the subjective or spiritual age. So what do we understand by these terms? They give us a certain framework to understand the progress of history. They give us a certain framework to make sense of uh, the way things have evolved. So the subjective, as the symbolic age, corresponds to this period of human development, which is pretty universal, but the traces of which we can find in some civilizations more than others. It's that period of human development when people had a natural kinship with the natural, a kinship with the natural world, where there was a strong sense of association of psychological and deeper realities with the physical world around them. So much so that the natural world became symbolic of something much deeper. And what is interesting about the symbolic age is that it's interesting that so many traditions refer to an esoteric past. In India, we have the Vedic age. In China, we have this reference to the wise rulers, the wise sages. In Greece, you have the reference to the Elysian mysteries. And many traditions preserve a memory of this age, which was somehow, they were led by people who had access to profounder wisdom. Not that everybody who lived at that point of time had access to this knowledge, but there were some who did, and they set the course of society. So this idea of a certain progressive, a seed which was planted right at the beginning of the social cycle, which then evolves and develops. So take, for example, the Vedic age, where you have clearly a distinction between those who were initiated and others who did not understand the deeper symbolism behind the symbols. So the fire, the yajna, sacrifice of the fire, it was also a symbolic one, experienced, and then experts and something about Vedic symbolism if you haven't already to this audience. But the symbolic age across traditions refers to this period when people related to the world around them and used symbols to depict or express deeper realities. Gradually, the symbolic age begins to crystallize into the typal age. And so the typal age refers to a period where social structures start to form and more concrete habits, ideas begin to take shape. And the typal age is also when many of these, the time when a lot of directions were given to society on the basis of rules. When these directions, when these guidelines become fixed and rigid and dogmatic, we land into the conventional age. The conventional age is a time of relative obscurity. It's a time when this, and that in turn leads to a questioning, a process of questioning, and the age of individualism begins. The individualistic age begins questioning those conventions in the hope of finding something truer, not necessarily behind the form, but looking forward. And so the individualistic age is an age of gigantic breaking down of the past, of the traditions of the past. And then finally, the subjective age, about which I will speak in a moment. Now, if you look at history and see this movement, we can see a movement of loose organic societies gradually forming into more those civilizations, and then the age of questioning, the age of reason, the age of Luther in Europe, of the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment, the age of reason. And this brings in a sense of active questioning of the past, but still a confusion as to what do you replace it with. So you have a certain tradition which gives a certain anchor to society, but now that anchor is no longer relevant to the time. So you break those traditions. What do you replace it with? And so the last 300 or 400 years have been a process of breaking of past traditions and the establishing of a new norms of society based on reason, based on thought. The very language that we are using, the sort of syntax, the way that we express ourselves today is so much influenced by the fact that we are born in this present time, some, a few centuries after the age of reason and enlightenment and so on. Because we think in a certain structured manner, which is very much a product of our time. And this would not be how people, say 2000 years ago, would approach the understanding of things. And so this is a tremendous advantage, but it's also a disadvantage because our notion of reality gets cut up into boxes. And the individualistic age leads to ordering of society, a tremendous stress on equality, on liberty, on universal rights, and so on. The difficulty comes in when it is not sure of what its goal is or what its aim is. And so that is where the beginnings of a subjective or a spiritual age come into play. We don't have the time to go into more detail about the transition from the rationalistic age to the subjective age, but we can say that we are very much in the throes of it. We are very much in this process of shifting from a certain mental view of the world to a more comprehensive, universal, spiritual view of the world, even socially. Where do we see these changes happening? We see it in education, for example, not at a global scale, but little islands of hope everywhere. So, for example, we would think of education as almost as an industrial product in the past, in the way that even the language of education was industrialized, so to say. You have periods, you have bells, you have sections, and you have classes, and it's a certain way of thinking about education, which is increasingly looking archaic. A subjective approach to education focuses on the individual, on the experience of the individual, on the deeper development of the individual. We see examples of subjectivism, of this movement towards recognition of the individual as something beyond just the mental being. We see it in art, we see it in literature, we even see it in popular culture. For example, in movies, and it's everywhere if you look for it, in books, in the number of people who are striving to think about their lives differently from just the old, what Shrovindo calls the human edition of the animal round, not just growing up, education, growing up, marrying, having children, providing for them, living, dying. That's a cycle which people are thinking more deeply about. And so the 5 stages of the human cycle give us a certain framework in which to make sense of the past as well as what we are going through today. Now, the word society in Sanskrit is very interesting. It's Samaj. And Samaj, if we go to the root of the word, Sam is together, and Aj is to move, to fight, to go forward. So Samaj is essentially moving forward together. That is what society is meant to be. And there are two ways of understanding this moving forward together. There is a Samaj which is based on the principle of division, and there is a Samaj which is based on the principle of unity. Society based on the principle of division is moving together while being in conflict with each other. So we move together, but there is a race, there is a competition. There's in society there's a wanting to get to the top of dominating, of conflict. And there is a Samaj or a society based on unity. What do we understand by unity? So here I would like to transition to the next major writing of Sri Aurobindo, which is the ideal of human unity. And the ideal of human unity takes up the question of course, as the title suggests, human unity as a whole. And so the question comes up, the largest unity that we can think about in a collective sense is humanity as a whole. And so how do we arrive at the goal of human unity is what this text takes up. So let's go back to the idea of Samaj. So Samaj based on division is what we see, of course, the common experience of life is this. Competition within societies, among nations, among continents. All this is part of the conflict in which we are all a part of, whether we like it or not, whether we are conscious of it or not. And then there is society based on unity, based on a sense of union. But there is a common mistake that is made by the mind. It confuses unity with uniformity. Now, what is the distinction between unity and uniformity? So at the level of the mind, when we think about union or coming together, we often mistake that with being similar, being the same. So if a group of people are united, it means somehow that they are of the same kind. But certainly human unity cannot mean that we will all become the same. Certainly it cannot mean that we will embrace a common culture, which can only be the culture of the lowest common denominator. That is not what we understand by unity. So the ideal of human unity, the text makes this clear distinction between uniformity and a deeper unity. And so how does it, let me present to you in brief the thesis of the ideal of human unity, really in very brief, because we are trying to do something very ambitious today by covering these two texts in 40 minutes. So the first thing to understand about the ideal of human unity is that it traces the development of social aggregates. And so we start from the very beginning and we look at how the first social aggregates were formed. So you had small tribes or clans, groups of people coming together, and society organized itself organically, which means that there was no clear hierarchy of leadership right from the beginning. It was more organic, in the same way that you can think of how, in a certain sense, how companies can grow today. You have a small company, you have a certain number of people, it's more organic. Yes, there is somebody, of course, there is a head, there is someone leading, but it's the movement is more fluid. As the aggregate grows and expands, it becomes more structured. And so we can look at the development of social aggregates broadly in three stages. The first stage is this loose organic unities. In India, for those of you who are familiar with Indian history, you have the Mahajanapada period, which is roughly in the 6th century BCE, when you had lots of different republics, lots of different states, each of them very vibrant, each of them with their own identity, even though they were all part of the larger Indian identity loosely, culturally, but politically very separate states. And these organic entities gradually began to coalesce. So again, in the West, you have a similar example. You have the city-states of Greece, or you have the growth of Rome, which eventually grew to swallow up these smaller entities and combine them into a gigantic empire. And something similar happens in India. And interestingly, something similar happens in China with the Qin dynasty coming in and taking over 5 or 6 different states and forcing them, combining them into some sort of larger empire. And so there is a common movement. And interestingly, even time-wise, it's happening at similar moments in history. So if you look at the pinnacle of the Greek city-states, it's around the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries BCE, which is also when in India you have a lot of an explosion of philosophical thinkers, an explosion of art and culture. And the process of centralization and empire building starts around the second centuries BCE. And again, it's the same thing, both in the West, in the East. And so there's a common trend that we see happening. And what is the advantage of these empires? Well, firstly, they are secure. They provide more stability. There is less conflict, less war, as long as the empire is strong and able to hold everyone together. The disadvantage is that there is less individuality. So if you look at from a cultural perspective, the city-states of Greece were a lot more interesting philosophically, culturally, artistically than the Romans were. But the Greeks without the Romans would not have survived. Their legacy, their art, and their culture would not have spread and become so much synonymous with the Western world if there was not some movement of assimilation. So we have a strange paradox when we talk about the movement of human unity. So on one hand, we are saying that the most which are small, which are not very centralized, which are not authoritarian. But on the other hand, we are saying that these are also unstable societies. They lead often to conflicts and wars. And more peaceful, stable societies are the ones which are bigger, with stress on uniformity. And so pause for a moment and let's go back to what we started out with. This movement between the individual and the group. This movement between between the self of the individual and the self of the group. So when we talk about development of empires, we see that there is an emphasis on uniformity, which leads to some kind of union, but that union is not very lasting because most of these empires eventually break, even the greatest of them. Even if they have survived for centuries, they eventually break. The next major social aggregate is the nation. And what the nation does is that it is able to actually combine the advantages of both the smaller group as well as the larger group. The nation gives a larger frame in which there is a certain amount of peace and stability. And if it is truly a nation, it also allows its members a lot of individuality, a lot of diverse expression. So now when we talk about world union, we have to move from nation states to the world as a whole. And so a common error that we make, as we discussed earlier, is thinking that if we must be united, we must somehow be the same. But that is obviously not only unlikely to happen, it's undesirable. And to understand the root problem, we must go back to the philosophical underpinnings of Sri Aurobindo's social philosophy. And this leads us to the idea of the self. The idea of the self, as it is understood in the Indian tradition, as it is expressed in the Upanishads, is a self which is one and many. It is not a linear binary self. It is not an either or self. It is both. It is at the same time capable of infinite manifestation and diversity while retaining its fundamental oneness. And so for the perfection of the collective, when we talked about the human cycle, we discussed that a spiritual age is what we are leading to. And this notion of the spiritual age is, of course, based on the notion of the spirit. In the ideal of human unity, similarly, we are saying for human unity to manifest itself in its fullness, you need an understanding of the self, which is one and the many at the same time. In other words, the union, the layer at which we are united, is something which supports an infinite amount of diversity. That's what we understand truly by human unity, not in a superficial external sense, but in a living inner sense. Now, you might wonder that these ideas are too abstract or that they don't have any living connection with the world around you. But I would beg to differ. Pause for a moment and step back from the immediate politics of whichever countries you are listening from and look at the progression of human development over the last few centuries and see the present moment as a mere blip in time, and instead try and see the trends which are manifesting themselves. Then we realize that instead of being filled with pessimism or gloom about individual circumstances, we can adopt a more detached view, a more impersonal. We can withdraw into the Purusha behind and observe a certain movement of the world leading towards something. This is how we may link social development with the idea of evolution. That even what appears to us to be momentarily a problem or a disaster or a conflict is ultimately something that needs to be worked out, something that needs to be uh, fitted into the entire scheme before you can have a fullness of realization. And so we find ourselves at a time where the old order has broken down. By old order, I mean the traditional religious view of the world. The rational order which replaced it is insufficient. It does not. It is not a perfect replacement, and the spiritual truth which we may perceive is not yet a reality. And so we are in fact stuck neither in the sort of certainties of the past, nor do we live in the realizations of the future. And that really is pretty much a summation of the human condition. So if we look at the progress of humanity, we see that we are at this tipping point, as a phrase which has been used by a well-known author. We are at this tipping point where something new has to manifest, and the old is no longer giving us the answers or solutions to that something new. And so I would argue that instead of being consumed by the immediate problems of the present or the immediate play of politics and the play of news around us, step back and try and see the larger forces at work. And that's what Sri Aurobindo's two books that we discussed, that's what they help us to do. They give us a certain key in which to understand the broader forces at work. And that enables a more complete understanding of what's happening around us. So there are many other ideas, of course, in the two texts which we can explore. But I think that to start with, this is an adequate sort of introduction. And the last 5 minutes that I have, what I would do is to share with you an interesting idea that we see in the human cycle at the end when he talks about spiritual age of society. A common misunderstanding that people have when we use the word spiritual is to confuse it with religious. So when we say a spiritual age of society, we often look back at the past and we imagine that it would be a coming back of some form of religion that we may have an attachment to. Sri Aurobindo's notion of the spiritual age is very different from any religious understanding of the term. This is very important to get a grip on. In fact, he goes so far as to say that in a spiritual age, one of the hallmarks of the spiritual age is freedom. What do we understand by freedom? Not freedom simply in the sense of I will do whatever I want, but freedom to explore every idea, the freedom to to truly become who we are meant to be, even if that means going against the grain. What I mean by that is, he says in one place, the spiritual age gives this freedom to humanity, even to deny a truth of the spiritual age, such as the spirit itself, if it is sincere, provided it is sincere, because all sincere seeking ultimately leads to the realization of a larger truth. These are, of course, I'm paraphrasing this idea. These are not his words. So, when we speak about a spiritual age of humanity, what we mean is a realization of something that is not dependent on any external religious form, a realization of something that is deep rooted within each individual, regardless of race or gender or country or political belief or any other categorization that we make. And that unity at that level is what can lead us to a more perfected society and a more harmonious and united world. So these are, to me, very exciting ideas, because they give us a sense of what we need to work towards, not just individually but also collectively. And a lot of things appear to make sense when we see it from this perspective. So, uh, Vladimir, I am 4 minutes short of 40 minutes, but I think this is a good place to take questions and then see how we go.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Devdip, for this beautiful exposition. You gave us a sense of this developmental paradigm or vision of Sri Aurobindo. And there are several questions here. Of course, I have my own, but I will put them in. I will start with the questions which are available here. I will start from the bottom up. Religion of humanity equals spiritual age of humanity? It's a question.
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. So, in the ideal of human unity, Sri Aurobindo speaks about this religion of humanity. So now we get into a little bit of linguistics, use of words. In the ideal of human unity, Sri Aurobindo does not elaborate on a spiritual society. See, audience for which he is writing is very important to remember. So Sri Aurobindo writes each of his texts for a particular kind of audience. When he's presenting the ideal of human unity, he's not bringing in ideas of the supramental consciousness or the psychic being or spiritual change of mankind. He's really looking at it as a social and political thinker within quotes. He's presenting it to a social and political thinker. And so the term religion of humanity is used as the closest approximation to this understanding of a deeper collective spirituality. So Anandi is absolutely right. Religion of humanity is a reference, if not equal, but it's a sort of nod to this notion of a spiritual age of humanity. But he does not elaborate on this topic in the ideal of human unity. One has to go to other texts to really get the full picture. Another interesting point I would make is that even in the human cycle, where he has 4 chapters on the spiritual age of society, beautiful 4 chapters, the last 4 chapters, even there he does not present the full view of what a spiritual age of society really looks like. For that, one has to turn to the Life Divine and read the last 2 chapters of the Life Divine, because there the development of ideas is such that he can really launch himself into a full-fledged exploration, even though I have to admit it's very hard to understand, not just mentally, but really understand what it means, because it questions our boundaries of knowledge. So when he writes about the Gnostic society and the divine life, 2 beautiful chapters, in a sense, are the natural culmination of the Life Divine.
Beautiful. I must add to this also interesting notion of the mother who speaks about Auroville. Auroville was to be this new society, or the kind of the template, or some kind of, experiment,
Yes.
where the evolutionary experiment where all human beings come together from different cultures and nationalities and live together for the ideal of human unity to be realized on Earth. And she says, to be true Aurovillian, one must live, I am quoting now, a life essentially religious, but renouncing all religions from the past, present, or future. Religious life with renunciation of the cult, of the form. So to have that religious feeling, that
Yes.
sacred feeling within, as a natural psychic, so to say, quality of the soul, will be the leading force of a new society. In that sense, yes, it's a religion,
Yes.
but renouncing all religions, so to say.
Vladimir, the thing is with these words, it becomes there's so much of cultural and the context of the time. So, for example, the word spiritual is used today in common parlance much more loosely than it would have been used, say, 100 years ago.
Mhm.
Today, people use the word. I mean, the original idea of spirituality as being rooted in the spirit is something which is sometimes diluted. So people say, I'm having a spiritual experience, by which they can actually mean something quite different from what in the yoga we would understand as a spiritual experience. And
Definitely.
similarly with religion, there is a lot of this is a broader discussion, of course,
Yeah, sure.
but Shobindo does a pretty interesting uh, differentiation. He, in the human cycle, he says, because again he's writing for an audience which is not so familiar with spirituality in the human cycle, so he makes a difference between religionism and true religion. And religionism is this attraction for the form and dogma, to be stuck to the superficiality of religion. And
Cult.
obviously, that is
Yeah.
not the answer that we are looking
Right.
for.
Yeah. There is a difference
Shall
between.
we take the next question?
Yes, sure.
Yes.
Um,
Sorry. Yes.
yes, and there is one more question. I have read the human cycle, says Patrick Beldio, as proposing 6 stages and not 5 stages. So the last stage will be spiritual, and whereas subjective will be just penultimate, so to say, a transition to the
Mm.
spiritual age. Yeah, well, yeah, it's quite obvious. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Please, can you comment on this? Yes.
Yeah, I'm happy to have this question from my friend Patrick.
Oh,
Um, yes, so six stages. So it's an interesting observation. Well, I think that the fullness of the subjective age is really the same as the spiritual age. But the subjective age is can also be seen as something that happens in stages. And in one of the chapters in the human cycle, Shobindu takes up the idea of various stages as we move towards the full subjective age. What do we mean by the full subjective age? Essentially, the subjective age is an age in which people identify with the self within. That is the fullness of the subjective age. But there are many selves before we arrive at the final true self. And so the but those errors are also, steps on the way. So and sometimes it can even lead to dangerous errors. But still, um, I think that uh, the subjective age in its sort of highest or deepest sense is a spiritual age.
mm,
um, yeah, I would that's how I would see it, how I would
mm.
read the text.
Yeah, in this context also, if you don't mind, it is interesting to mention Gita, where where Arjuna asks Sri Krishna, now you mixed all the jatis, all the varnas, how would we know who is born in which family? So if they are mixed, so in the family of Brahmins, Shudra can be born, in the family of Shudras, Brahmin can be born. So, and answer comes later, which is interesting in the Gita. And he says, now everyone in his heart will find me the supreme. This
Mm,
individualism is so important to find the truth, the true connection to the universal truth within your individual soul. And that is the
mm,
subjective age, basically, which leads us to the spiritual age. So there is a very beautiful also exposition in the Gita. There is another question here. Um, the Western political theories have provided several notions of peace. How does Sri Aurobindo explain peace from a political and spiritual perspective? If you kindly enlighten me on this topic, thank you. This
mm,
is from
mm.
Avjit Biswas.
Yes. Mm. So, I mean, when we think about peace as a lack of conflict, peace as mutual understanding or mutual respect between countries, that is certainly one way of looking at of looking at the opposite of conflict. You know, you have peace instead of conflict. I think that from a deeper spiritual perspective, um, the stress would be on union rather than peace, because peace is an outcome of something. And if we focus on the outcome rather than the fundamental root cause of the problem, then we will always be struggling, because we're always trying to address the symptom rather than the underlying root problem. The root problem is this notion of division, this notion of a separation from this true self, both of the individual and of the collectivity. And so I would say that Sri Aurobindo's approach to this notion, to the idea of peace, would be, if you solve the fundamental problem, you will have peace, and much more than just peace. But if we approach the problem from the other end, well, I'm not saying it is futile. It has its place, and sometimes the external structures can play an important role in furthering this objective, but it is not the real solution.
Thank you. There is one phrase from the mother, first victory, then peace. Victory is to be first. You can't bring peace without victory. That won't be a peace. It would be something else.
Yes.
It will be a deficient peace of some kind. Um, there is another question
think
from,
I think we missed a question. Yes, yes.
yes, Jai Prakash Das. Is is the present education system contributing to social transformation? Please answer with the example in context of Sri Aurobindo's social philosophy.
Yeah, so it depends on what we mean by social transformation. And there are lots of social transformations happening. I mean, in a more in the ordinary parlance, like lots of different changes happening in society, lots of all kinds of gaps and inequalities being addressed. And I think a lot of progress has been made over the last few hundred years in these domains. The stress on liberty, the stress on equality, and of course, to some extent, the education system, by talking about these ideas and by emphasizing the importance of these ideas, plays a role. But if we understand social transformation in the sense of a change of human consciousness, well, then whatever is happening in spite of the system and not because of it. Or happening because of it, but in a perverse sense, in a sort of ironic sense, that you're so frustrated with it that you look for something else and you chance upon a greater truth or a greater knowledge. So it's certainly not something which is encouraging it fully. And and this is of course a challenge of our age, how do we have an education which inculcates this aspiration for something deeper, without it becoming religious, without it becoming dogmatic? So this is something that I think more and more people are asking themselves, and I think a lot of people are trying to experiment. And to here in Pondicherry, this has been the the heart and soul of the ashram school. How do we have an education which provides children a new way of being, a new way of looking at life, a new way of understanding themselves, freed from all the uh, baggage of the past. Our students' prayer is, "Make of us the hero warriors." It's a prayer about the hero warriors who fight against the past, the great battle of the future against the past. So this is something that I think a lot of people are asking themselves. So I certainly don't think the present education system is actively helping towards social transformation, but I do believe a lot of people are asking themselves how they can create alternative systems.
Thank you. Beautiful. And there is one more question. Thanks for beautiful talk. How will an individual participate in collective evolution? How much effect is seen around the environment through one's personal growth and development of consciousness? How individual
This is a very nice question. Yes, yes. So how will an individual participate in collective evolution? So I would say first and foremost by working on themselves. When the individual uh, grows and progresses and evolves, the effect of it is much more powerful than we imagine in the collectivity around us. And so when we say how much effect is seen around the environment through one's personal growth, I would say it is not in a limited rational sense. It is not as if today I'm peaceful, so everybody around me is peaceful. Not in that sense. But every time there is a victory within, every time there is an obstacle which has been overcome within, it creates something in the total sum of the atmosphere. It adds something to the totality of the work that has to be done, addition or contribution to the development of the collective. And one underestimates the power of one individual. There is a line in Sri Aurobindo's magnum opus, Savitri, um, even one man's surrender can save the world. This idea of an individual transformation with dramatic or radical effects on the collectivity. So the best way of participating is in doing it oneself.
And there is no other way, basically, to do it. These ideas that you
Yes,
can change it
yes,
socially somehow through some kind of, artificial devices in the social structure
yes,
usually fail because they do not have the consciousness to support from the individuals. That's how we are evolving.
yes,
Mm.
yes.
There are more questions here.
And also, Vladimir, each one does what they can. Sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think there was a. Yeah, I was just saying that uh, each one must do what they can do at the best of themselves.
Mm.
So I mean, the, um, while we are saying that the best way of helping the totality is to work it in any limited way, play their important role and part.
Mm.
It's just that if we want to understand the root problem, or if you want to solve the root cause, then it's an inner work and there's no other solution.
There is
So I mean, yeah.
there is an interesting idea which Rubindo develops in his social thought, is this work between individual and society, social structure. So society is always kind of keeping the equilibrium of some kind. It is very conventional or rather conservatory. It's conservating everything, all the changes, and keeps up with certain laws. But individual is always disturbing the equilibrium, always coming out, always breaking the rules, and modifies that equilibrium constantly. So there is a dialectical development between the individual who is making changes within the social structure, which is keeping them, so to say, holding them to a certain extent. So this dialectical development is taking place. But the change is taking place only through individual effort, only through individual development
Yes.
and need.
Yes. Yes.
This is the unique thought of Sri Aurobindo, by the way. That even there are many places which we are quoting from Human Cycle for Auroville also, because we had an idea in Auroville of some kind of social consciousness and development of social consciousness, which is very difficult to address. How could that social consciousness be developed if individuals are not doing the work? So the social consciousness is the
Absolutely.
sum of individuals' efforts. You know? It is being created on the individual opening to the truth, and not there is no social opening to the truth. It's very difficult to create
Mm.
unless individuals
Yes.
are there. So
Yes. Mm.
it's a very interesting topic. Yes, there are more questions. Knowing the world, that the world works in paradoxes, can there ever be a clear emergence of a transformed society, and how does it translate in this world?
Well, in a sense, the original paradox is that the self is one and many. And really the essential problem of existence is that we are not able to reconcile these two truths. And even in spiritual traditions, the approach has been to focus on the aspect of the self, and in in non-spiritual or in the materialistic view of the world, the focus has been on the manifestation of the many. And in a sense, all life, all yoga, all evolution and progress is to arrive at this reconciliation of being rooted in the self and seeing that self as manifesting as many. And so it is only when this paradox is resolved, which obviously cannot be resolved mentally, which obviously has to be resolved experientially within oneself, and that is when there can be a transformed society. And all these opposites that we are dealing with, individual versus group, unity versus uniformity, um, all of that finds its reconciliation when it has been based on that fundamental experience.
Right.
And that has been the message of so many spiritual traditions also.
Beautiful. Yeah. That's the uniqueness of this individual supreme in the supreme environment in which it can see itself in
Yes,
everything and everything in oneself and everybody in oneself. That unity,
yes,
consciousness of unity, which is different from consciousness of identity, as Mother says. There is
yes,
ananda of identity and ananda of unity. And the ananda of unity is achieved through
yes.
this interaction, which creates the social aggregate or organism.
Hmm. You know, one of the most, Vladimir, one of the most interesting things about Sri Aurobindo's writings on social political philosophy, even in about spirituality, is how he sees each part of the totality playing an important role. So when Sri Aurobindo, for example, reconciles spirit and matter, he's also reconciling East and West. He reconciles different traditions. He reconciles this idea of a unity of knowledge, of not just of experience, but also unity of knowledge, of unity of truth, is something which has this touch of tremendous wideness, tremendous I don't know. I mean, acceptance is too weak a word, but a kind of comprehensiveness, which is one of the hallmarks of all his writings. And that is very interesting. because you get freed from limited notions. It's not about this particular political ideology versus another ideology. It's not about one philosophy versus another philosophy. It's a certain approach to knowledge which incorporates the truth of all traditions of all ways. And that is something which comes out very strongly in these texts also, that we have to free ourselves from the illusion of a limited knowledge. And the moment we identify with a limited perspective, we can be sure that we don't have the full truth.
This ideal of unity was always there in his writings. And even this, if you Google a human unity, you will see that it is not a very popular idea for some reason. It's quite interesting. It's actually very difficult to understand what human unity may be, because behind this, there is a spiritual perception. And that thing is not totally understood. And that's why human unity is not really totally wanted, or it's not yet the target of humanity. Humanity doesn't see it yet, as though the institutions are already developing in that direction, and subconsciously everything is moving in that direction. Still, in our conscious part, we don't yet totally understand what is this crown, why we need this human unity. Because there is a spiritual experience behind, which will open up totally a new dimension of our consciousness. And this is really a beautiful vision of Sri Aurobindo, yes. To unite everything into oneness. And we see it in Indian tradition very beautifully in all these mantras, for example, Sarvesham Svastir Bhavatu, may there be well-being of all. Why of all? May there be fullness of all, auspiciousness, happiness of all. And I was always
Yes.
thinking, everybody has to be happy, fulfilled. Um, uh, how come? How can you offer this to the whole world that everyone is happy? I think this is the foundation of Indian culture, which is beaming through Sri Aurobindo as the great rishi coming back to us to bring this fundamental notion of the Veda, of oneness, of unity of the whole humanity. Beautiful. Thank you
I
very
think that's a
much.
very nice place to end, Vladimir. Yes, beautiful. Thank you also for your inputs. And thanks to all the people who've asked questions, friends from Orville and other places, Anandi, and all the others who have asked us something.
I hope we answered all the
And
questions.
yeah,
Looks like.
I think so, yes. I think Anandi just posted a question. What is the truth emerging amongst the different forces at play? Yeah, I think I'll refer to Vladimir's last comments. The truth is the truth of unity and of a diversity which can manifest on the basis of that unity. Yeah, that's ultimately what we are leading towards, hopefully.
So each element has to be truthful in that unity, and that's the diversity.
Yes,
That uniqueness of
yes,
each element has to be maintained in relation to the
yes,
oneness. If it is
exactly.
not, then it
Yes,
is suppressed. Then there is it's a false unity. It's uniformity again.
yes.
Beautiful. Thank you, Devdip, for wonderful exposition. We need it nowadays in the world very much, and we hope to meet with you again and to explore more in that direction, especially in social and political
Thank
thought.
you. Thank you. I enjoyed interacting with all of you and see you. Thank you.
All the best.
Bye
Bye.
bye.